The colonial newspaper is a small thing. It's 4 pages maybe. And on that last page, property is being advertised: land, horses, wagons, and human beings.
The transatlantic slave trade represents one of history's darkest epochs, where millions of Africans were forcibly uprooted, dehumanized, and subjected to unfathomable horrors. These voyages, underpinned by cruelty and greed, saw men, women, and children packed into ships, enduring conditions so dire that they defy imagination. This video delves deep into the haunting journey these individuals faced aboard the slave ships, offering a lens into the stark reality of human endurance and the indomitable spirit of survival. Capture and march to the coast. The genesis of the tormenting journey for many enslaved Africans began not on the ships, but deep within the African continent itself. While the European slave traders awaited on the coasts, indigenous and local groups, driven by the allure of European goods or compelled by rivalries, often played an unwitting role in supplying them with human cargo. Conflict was a frequent precursor to enslavement. In the wake of intertribal warfare or skirmishes with neighboring regions, the victors often took prisoners. These captives, instead of being incorporated or ransomed, as was custom in some cultures, found themselves in an unfamiliar predicament. The European demand for slaves transformed these prisoners of war into commodities, where they were traded, often with a cold, transactional efficiency. Raids were another common means to procure slaves. Small villages, particularly those situated far from powerful tribal centers, were vulnerable. Treachery, too, played its part. Stories abound of deceit where individuals were entrapped through false pretenses or promises. Some were lured with the idea of a job or a better life, while others were betrayed by those they considered kin or allies. In certain cases, local leaders, seeking European favor or goods, would trade their own subjects, relegating them to a life of bondage across the Atlantic. Having been captured, the next phase for these unfortunates was the grueling march to the coast. These journeys were marathons of misery, often stretching hundreds of miles. Bound in chains or yokes with little to protect their feet from the rugged terrains, the captives embarked on a journey characterized by exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Every step towards the coast signified a step away from their homeland, their loved ones, and the life they once knew. The march's brutality cannot be understated. Given the commercial nature of the slave trade, there was an inherent pressure to deliver as many healthy slaves to the coast as possible. However, the conditions of the march, combined with meager rations and the ever-looming threat of disease, meant mortality rates were high. Those who fell ill or could no longer keep up with the pace were often abandoned or killed. In the face of such adversity, some tried to escape, while others saw in death a sweet release, opting for suicide to free themselves from the impending horrors. The Barakaons. The journey from the interiors of Africa to the coastline was a torment in itself. But it was not the end of the trials for those who had been captured. On reaching the coast, these individuals, already worn from the trials of the march, were thrust into Barakaons. These were fortified holding areas, essentially makeshift prisons, where the captives would be detained until they could be loaded onto a waiting slave ship. A barracoon, derived from the Spanish word baraka, meaning hut or shed, was a chilling testament to the commodification of human beings during the transatlantic slave trade. Often constructed from local materials such as bamboo or palm leaves, these enclosures bore little semblance to human habitation. They were cramped spaces where men, women, and children were piled upon one another, devoid of even basic amenities. The squalid conditions with poor ventilation and sanitation made them breeding grounds for diseases, many of which the captives, already weakened by their journey, had little resistance against. One can only imagine the mental anguish that pervaded these confines. Many of the incarcerated were still grappling with the abruptness of their capture, the severance from their families, and the realization that they might never see their homeland again. The Barracoons, with their oppressive atmosphere, only compounded this misery. It was not uncommon for the captives to witness or even experience brutal punishments meted out by the guards or traders, ostensibly to maintain order or exert dominance. The frequent sound of the whip and the cries it evoked became a haunting lullaby in these coastal dungeons. Amidst the tangible despair, the captives would often hear, perhaps for the first time, the rhythmic yet disconcerting sound of the ocean waves. For many, the sea was a foreign entity, its vastness and unpredictability invoking a primal fear. The ominous presence of the European ships, anchored not far from the shoreline, with their tall masts and foreign flags fluttering, served as a bleak reminder of the journey that still awaited. The duration of stay in a barracoon varied. Some endured only a few days, while others languished for months. The determining factor was the arrival and readiness of the slave ships. Often, traders would await a ship's arrival, or, if a ship was already docked, its capacity to take on more human cargo. This wait, marred by uncertainty, added a layer of psychological torment. Every sunrise brought with it the dread of being selected, of being further dehumanized in the European traders' meticulous inspection process where individuals were poked, prodded, and assessed for their value. Despite the palpable hopelessness, barracoons became inadvertent melting pots of African cultures. People from diverse tribes, languages, and customs found themselves in close quarters. Forced by circumstance, they sought solace in each other's company, often forging bonds and creating a makeshift community. Boarding the slave ships. With the arrival or readiness of a slave ship, the moment would come for the captives to depart the barracoons and embark on the next harrowing phase of their ordeal. The process of boarding the ships was orchestrated with a cold, transactional precision that further underscored the captives' commodified status in the eyes of the traders. The enslaved individuals were first subjected to a final inspection. European traders and ship surgeons would carefully examine each person, assessing their health and vitality. A healthy male was particularly prized, as he would fetch a higher price in the New World markets. Those deemed unfit, either due to illness or perceived weakness, would sometimes be left behind, abandoned to an uncertain fate. After this assessment, the selected captives were shackled, often in pairs, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy iron chains. This chaining was not only a method of restraint, but also a psychological tool, further impressing upon the captives their subjugated status and inhibiting any notions of rebellion or escape. The journey from the barracoons to the ships was typically short, but it was laden with dread. As the chained groups were led to the shore, they would get their first close view of the slave ships. These vessels, specifically designed or modified for the human cargo they carried, were foreboding sights. Their high wooden walls and narrow entry points made them seem impenetrable, and their vast size was intimidating to many who had never encountered such large structures on water before. The actual boarding process was a chaotic and traumatic experience. Some captives, gripped by fear or realizing the gravity of their predicament, resisted. These acts of defiance were often met with swift and brutal punishment. Whippings were common, serving both as a punishment for the individual and a warning to others. Those who persisted in their resistance or were deemed too troublesome were sometimes killed on the spot, their lives callously snuffed out as a display of dominance. For many of the enslaved, the ship's deck was their first encounter with Europeans up close. The sight of these strangers, with their unfamiliar attire and features, coupled with the language barrier, added another layer of alienation and fear. The captives were herded onto the ship, the men typically held in separate compartments from the women and children. This separation was strategic, aiming to diminish the potential for coordinated resistance by breaking potential alliances or familial bonds. The conditions on board were a stark contrast from the vast African landscapes the captives were accustomed to. The ship's hold, where most of the enslaved were confined, was a dark, damp, and suffocating space. The ceilings were so low that most could not stand upright. The captives were forced to lie down side by side with scarcely any room to move. The stench in these cramped quarters, a mix of sweat, vomit, excrement, and fear, was almost unbearable. Daily life aboard. Life aboard a slave ship was dictated by a monotonous yet harrowing routine. punctuated by moments of fear, brutality, and fleeting interactions. For the enslaved Africans, every sunrise and sunset marked not the passage of time but a continued ordeal, a relentless assault on their dignity, spirit, and physical well-being. The day would typically start early, with the ship's crew attending to their duties as the first rays of sunlight broke the horizon. For the captives in the hold, the dawn was just a slight shift in the ambient light, with the oppressive darkness of the ship's belly giving way to a dim gloom. Feeding routines were an integral part of the daily schedule. The enslaved were given 2 meals a day, usually morning and late afternoon. The act of feeding was not a communal or comforting experience, but a logistical exercise for the crew. The captives were often fed in batches, with each group being momentarily unshackled to consume their meager rations. The food, a blend of grains and pulses, was served in large wooden troughs, with individuals hastily eating directly from them. Water, distributed in scant quantities, was often foul-tasting, having been stored in algae-covered casks. The act of resistance was a part of daily life for some. Refusal to eat was a common form of protest against the horrific conditions. The ship's crew would respond brutally to such acts of defiance. The speculum oris, a cruel instrument designed to pry open mouths, would be used to force-feed those who resisted, adding another layer of violation to their experience. The ship's deck was occasionally accessible to the enslaved, especially during the dancing routines orchestrated by the crew. These sessions, touted as exercise periods, were less about the well-being of the enslaved and more about maintaining the value of the cargo. Men and women brought onto the deck would be forced to jump, move, or dance, with the crew using ropes or whips to ensure their compliance. While these moments offered a brief reprieve from the stifling confines below deck, they were also instances of humiliation and objectification. Yet amidst the daily horrors, there were moments of human connection. In the cramped quarters of the ship's hold, the enslaved would sometimes find solace in whispered conversations, sharing stories of their homes, families, and dreams. Songs born from the depths of despair or nostalgia would occasionally ripple through the captive community, their melodies a testament to their enduring spirit. Such interactions were not always peaceful. Given the deliberate mixing of various ethnic and tribal groups, tensions were inevitable. Misunderstandings, born out of language barriers or cultural differences, would sometimes escalate into conflicts. However, more often than not, a shared misery would forge bonds of understanding and camaraderie. Instances of punishment were frequent and public. The crew, always wary of rebellion or defiance, ruled with an iron fist. Whippings were common, with the deck often serving as the stage for such brutal displays. The sounds of a whip cracking, followed by anguished cries, became an all-too-familiar backdrop to daily life aboard. For the enslaved, these moments served as grim reminders of their powerlessness in the face of their captors. Resistance and uprisings. While the conditions aboard the slave ships were meticulously designed to suppress, control, and dehumanize, the indomitable spirit of the enslaved often shone through in acts of resistance and rebellion. Their defiance ranged from passive acts of non-compliance to full-blown uprisings, challenging their oppressors and asserting their innate desire for freedom. One of the most common forms of passive resistance was the refusal to eat. This act was not merely an expression of despair, but a conscious choice to resist the oppressor's control. The implications were well understood by both sides. For the captors, every death diminished the profitability of the voyage, while for the enslaved, it was a reclaiming of agency, even if that meant choosing death over bondage. The traders and crew, understanding the economic repercussions of such defiance, would often resort to force-feeding, using tools like the speculum oris to pry open the mouths of the resolute. However, passive resistance was merely the tip of the iceberg. The volatile mix of despair, anger, and the close confinement of hundreds, if not thousands, of physically strong individuals created conditions ripe for revolt. Whispers of rebellion would often spread in the ship's bowels, with plans being hatched in hushed tones during the fleeting moments when the enslaved could communicate. These uprisings often required a level of coordination and secrecy that was difficult to achieve given the close scrutiny of the crew. Weapons, in the traditional sense, were unavailable, yet improvisation was the key. Chains, once a symbol of bondage, could be transformed into weapons. Pieces of wood or any other accessible materials could be repurposed for the cause. One of the most notable slave ship revolts occurred aboard the Amistad in 1839. Led by Sengbe Pie, known as Joseph Cinque, the enslaved Mende Africans managed to free themselves from their shackles, overpowered the crew, and took control of the ship. Though they demanded to be returned to Africa, the ship was seized off the coast of Long Island by the U.S. Navy. The ensuing legal battle, which reached the U.S. Supreme Court, resulted in the Africans' release and return to their homeland, making it a significant episode in the broader fight against slavery. The Zong Massacre, while not a revolt, is another crucial event that underscores the tragic extremes of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1781, facing water shortages and a cargo of sick Africans, the ship's crew made the chilling decision to throw 132 enslaved people overboard, hoping to claim their loss on insurance. This act of barbarity, when brought to light, horrified many and fueled the abolitionist movement in Britain. Even in cases where revolts were momentarily successful, the challenges of navigating unfamiliar waters and the lack of provisions made sustained control of the ship difficult. Some revolts ended with the ship being recaptured by its crew or by other vessels. In such instances, the repercussions for the rebels were severe. The tight versus loose packing debate. In the cruel calculus of the transatlantic slave trade, where human lives were reduced to mere commodities, decisions were driven by profit margins and economic considerations. One of the ongoing debates among slave traders was the most efficient method to transport their human cargo from Africa to the New World. This debate, often referred to as the tight versus loose packing debate, encapsulated the dehumanizing nature of the trade, revealing the traders' priorities and their cold, transactional view of the enslaved. The tight packing philosophy advocated maximizing profits by cramming as many enslaved Africans onto a ship as physically possible. Proponents of this method argued that even though mortality rates might be higher due to the squalid, cramped conditions and the resultant spread of diseases, the sheer number of survivors would more than compensate for the loss, ensuring a higher overall profit. It was a numbers game, with the traders willing to accept a higher wastage in favor of a bulkier final product. Ships that adopted this method were often filled to the brim, with the enslaved lying shoulder to shoulder, their limbs often intertwined, with little room to move or even breathe. On the other hand, the loose packing method advocated for providing a bit more space to each individual on board. Those favoring this approach believed that by reducing overcrowding, they could potentially decrease mortality rates. Better conditions, they argued, would ensure that a larger percentage of the cargo would arrive in the New World in a healthier state, fetching better prices. While still far from humane, ships employing this method had slightly better ventilation and marginally improved living conditions for the enslaved. The implications of each method were profound. For enslaved Africans aboard a tightly packed ship, the experience was a living nightmare. The extreme overcrowding exacerbated every horror of the Middle Passage. Lack of space meant that many were forced to lie in their own waste, accelerating the spread of diseases. The stifling heat, combined with minimal ventilation, made breathing a challenge, with the air thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, and vomit. The psychological trauma of being packed so closely, unable to move, and constantly in contact with others was immeasurable. In contrast, while loose packing provided a modicum of relief from the extreme conditions of tight packing, it was by no means a merciful or humane approach. The enslaved still endured appalling conditions, including chains, malnutrition, and the constant threat of violence. However, the slightly improved conditions did mean that mortality rates were often lower on loosely packed ships. Economically, the debate remained unresolved for much of the transatlantic slave trade's existence. Some traders, after calculating potential profits and losses, firmly stood by the tight packing method, while others saw merit in the loose packing approach. What's worth noting, however, is that this debate, at its core, was not about the welfare of the enslaved, but about profit optimization. It was a chilling discourse that treated human beings as mere variables in a business equation. Diseases and mortality. The voyage across the Atlantic, infamously known as the Middle Passage, was a crucible of suffering for the enslaved Africans. Among the many torments they faced, disease was one of the most pervasive and deadly. The combination of overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and psychological stress created a breeding ground for various illnesses. The impact of these diseases, both in terms of human suffering and mortality, was profound. Dysentery, often referred to as the bloody flux, was one of the most common ailments on board. Caused by bacterial infections, it led to severe diarrhea, often with traces of blood or mucus, leading to dehydration and, in many cases, death. The cramped conditions of the ship's hold, where individuals had little space to move and were forced to lie in their own excrement, accelerated the spread of this disease. Malaria and yellow fever, both mosquito-borne diseases, were also prevalent, especially when ships traveled through or anchored near tropical regions. The symptoms, including high fever, chills, and nausea, weakened the already malnourished and stressed enslaved Africans, making them more susceptible to other illnesses or leading to death. Then there were respiratory infections. The damp, poorly ventilated conditions of the ship's hold were ideal for the spread of diseases like tuberculosis or pneumonia. Constant exposure to cold sea air, coupled with the lack of adequate clothing or protection, meant that many developed severe coughs, which, if untreated, could escalate to more severe conditions. Scurvy, a disease resulting from vitamin C deficiency, was another common affliction, not just among the enslaved, but also among the ship's crew. Manifesting in symptoms like swollen gums, joint pain, and fatigue, it was a direct consequence of the monotonous and nutritionally inadequate diet provided on the ship. The mental toll of captivity, the trauma of being torn from one's homeland, and the daily horrors of ship life also had physiological manifestations. Despair and depression were rampant. This mental anguish sometimes manifested in physical ailments, from digestive problems to heart complications. Some, unable to bear the torment, chose to end their lives, seeing in death an escape from the unrelenting nightmare. Given this onslaught of diseases and the lack of any meaningful medical care, it's unsurprising that mortality rates aboard slave ships were staggeringly high. Historical records suggest that, on average, 12–15% of the enslaved died on each voyage, though in some cases, especially during longer journeys. Or if there was a significant disease outbreak, this figure could be much higher. It's worth noting that these figures don't capture the countless others who, while they survived the voyage, arrived in the New World in such poor health that they perished shortly after. Arrival in the New World. After enduring the harrowing ordeal of the Middle Passage, the sight of land on the horizon brought a mix of emotions for the enslaved Africans. The vast expanse of the Americas or the Caribbean islands, with their unfamiliar landscapes, beckoned as the final destination of their forced voyage. Yet, this arrival, far from being a reprieve, was the beginning of a new chapter of subjugation and exploitation. As ships anchored in the bustling ports, the enslaved, many weakened by disease, malnutrition, or the psychological toll of the journey, were prepared for sale. Before being presented to potential buyers, they underwent a final inspection. This process, much like the assessments in Africa, was a dehumanizing experience. Ship surgeons or traders would meticulously examine each individual, assessing their health, vitality, and potential for labor. Those with visible ailments or signs of rebelliousness were sometimes branded or marked, ensuring a lower price in the market. To maximize their sale value, the enslaved were often cleaned up for the auctions. This might involve washing them, oiling their skin to give it a healthier sheen, or treating visible wounds to mask the horrors of the journey. The aim was to present the enslaved in the best possible condition, further reinforcing their status as commodities rather than human beings. The auctions themselves were grand, grotesque spectacles. Enslaved individuals or groups were paraded in front of prospective buyers, who would inspect, negotiate, and barter, reducing human lives to mere transactions. Family members, having endured the horrors of the voyage together, were often torn apart, sold to different owners with little regard for familial bonds. Parents were separated from children, siblings from each other, adding another layer of trauma to their already immense suffering. Those purchased would be introduced to their new lives of bondage. Depending on the region and the specific needs of the colonies, they might find themselves laboring in vast sugar plantations, tobacco fields, cotton farms, or mines. The work was grueling, with long hours under the scorching sun or in stifling conditions. The tools and techniques were unfamiliar to many, requiring them to learn quickly under the ever-present threat of punishment. Life in the New World was a relentless cycle of work, interspersed with moments of rest in rudimentary slave quarters. These living spaces, often cramped huts or cabins, were minimalistic, providing just enough shelter and warmth. Here, away from the prying eyes of overseers or masters, the enslaved would find moments of respite. They would share stories, songs, or traditions from their homelands, subtly forging a new, creolized culture born from the shared experience of captivity.